Now, okay, so welcome to this week's Wednesday review session. And I hope you got to enjoy some of your time, at least some of your extra time off, I hope. So weeks where we only have one class, I feel always end up being kind of weird because it's like, okay, where are we getting back on track? And we kind of make a jump. Last week we talked about weather and climate and how atmospheric circulation and ocean circulation make Antarctica as cold as it is today. That was basically the overall theme. We did not have class Monday, and then I released a lecture today that is based on geology. So a bit of a shift, but with the long goal of taking us to learning about how Antarctica got cold, because that's kind of what next week's topic is. So there is a lab due this Friday based on mostly last week's material, the week 2 atmospheric circulation material, and the TAs do have an instruction sheet for that, but I will talk a little bit about that at the end of this session. There's also the first of 2 lecture quizzes open on Gaucho Space. And just to remind you all, that is separate from the labs. Aside from the lab assignments, which are kind of confusingly labeled as quizzes on Gaucho Space, there's 2 quizzes that test you on the lecture material, and one of those is open right now. It is due this Sunday. Looking ahead, the midterm is going to be due on February 7th. So we're about a quarter of the way through the class now. Things go really fast on the quarter system, and that's why I've been putting the quiz now. That's why I put the quiz now when I did. The first reading assignment based on the news article is open now. That's not technically due until the week after the midterm, but that's something you can get ahead on if you want to try to save yourself a little bit of energy around the midterm itself. I will be, kind of like how I've been putting lists of key terms in the review presentations, I will put a study guide out probably late next week ahead of the midterm also, with a more exhaustive list of key terms. I wanted to talk about the quiz. So the quiz consists of 10 multiple choice or true or false questions, and those are all automatically graded, and those are a point each. And then there's 2 short answer questions that you can write more if you'd like, but we're looking for like 2 sentences most, 3 if you're feeling really, really creative about something. And the TAs are going to grade those. So it's not like you have to include certain buzzwords to get Gaucho Space to grade those 2 questions the TAs are going to look at. And the quiz is not going to cover at all Lecture 5, which I released today. Lecture 5, which is the first of the geology lectures, is not included on this quiz. It's material from lectures 2, 3, and 4, so human and physical geography, and then atmospheric and ocean circulation, as well as the week that we covered oceanic and atmospheric circulation, I had y'all read a couple of articles in that climate articles folder, as well as watch a short clip of Frozen Planet, and you should have read and seen those before you take the quiz. I will say there's not a lot on the quiz on them necessarily, but you will definitely have wanted to read them and watch them. It will help. And in terms of key terms to study for it, I kind of covered a review of the geography material a while back, or last week when I did a review session after week 1. So those key terms and stuff to study are kind of in that. And I will say that with these review slides, it's not completely exhaustive when I put key terms in here. It's kind of the most important terms and the ones I'm most likely to ask questions about. But in terms of like, oh, is this all I need to know? Not really. Like there's going to be other terms that you'll want to know and that you'll probably understand better as you understand the context of these better. But what did we learn about last week? We went over a lot, but the main things we covered were how solar radiation is uneven at different latitudes. Even though the sun is consistently emitting the same amount of radiation usually, and the same amount is reaching Earth, different latitudes get sunlight more effectively, essentially, because near the poles, Earth is angled and spread out, and the sunlight gets spread out. And that actually leads to atmospheric circulation to start. The buildup of too much solar radiation at the equator and too little at the poles causes convection currents to form. And remember, convection is when heat transfers by moving via something, whether that's air or water, or in the geology lecture I just posted, I talk about how magma actually or actually not even magma, technically solid mantle, just very plastic, ductile solid mantle convex, and that drives plate tectonics to a big degree. So the latitudes are actually one thing that keep Antarctica cold, because there's not very much solar radiation building. There's not much solar radiation gets to Antarctica, essentially. It's also kept cold by the fact that for a good chunk of the year, the axis tilts it out of the sunlight, and then the Antarctic circumpolar current isolates it from warm ocean water. So if that were not the case, Antarctica would probably be about as cold as the Arctic. Cold, but not quite as miserably cold as it is now. And in terms of atmospheric circulation, I lingered on how Antarctica is a high pressure zone, how the air is falling around the South Pole, and that's a big reason why Antarctica is so dry and why it's so windy. It's so windy because you have that air then going out towards the edges of the continent, and that gets accelerated by the downward sloping ice sheets, creating even more of a gradient. And it's dry because high pressure zones are generally dry. The falling air has lost its moisture elsewhere. The moisture was lost when the air rose at whatever latitude it started at and then got cool when it got in the upper atmosphere. So wherever that air is falling, like Antarctica, or if you look at one of the cells on the equator, you'll see that the air falling at 30 degrees. Those are the desert belts you get in Africa and North America, and actually both northern and southern Africa. Africa has desert belts from both the Sahara in the northern 30 degrees, and then the southern 30 degrees, it gets the Kalahari Desert and all the deserts in South Africa. So Africa is a really good example of how you get those deserts in both hemispheres from the desert belts. But anyway, kind of jammed in there, I talked about the ozone layer because it is something I like to talk about with Antarctica because of the ozone hole. It's something that's hard to fit in because it's not directly related to climate change. At one point when this class was taught, I had it was squeezed in with the climate change stuff at the end, and I kind of thought that was a little out of place. So I moved it here to fit it into a discussion of the different layers of the atmosphere, because it's frankly the most interesting thing about the stratosphere. And a very brief overview of the layers of the atmosphere. You got the troposphere, where you have most of the weather, and then above that is the stratosphere, where you have the ozone layer. And ozone mostly serves the purpose of shielding ultraviolet radiation, because it basically takes the hit for us. The ultraviolet radiation hits the ozone, and that breaks up and reforms and hits other oxygen molecules and continues on instead of reaching the surface and destroying our skin cells. And Antarctica has seen especially bad ozone depletion because worldwide human pollution has caused ozone depletion, but it's been concentrated in Antarctica because those pollutants get trapped in Antarctica during the winter by the polar vortex. So the hole forms when the polar vortex forms and isolates the pollutants above the continent. It doesn't help also that the reactions that break ozone go faster when it's cold. So that's one reason why Antarctica has seen such bad ozone depletion. I also talked about the Antarctic circumpolar current quite a bit. I mentioned earlier that it's a huge reason why Antarctica is so cold. It's the large, and I say it blocks warm air from reaching. I meant to say warm water, but I will fix that. But I talked a lot about different water masses and how those are defined by density and salinity. The only one I really want you to know about is Antarctic bottom water, because it's sort of interesting how it forms from sea ice formation, making the water especially salty, that salty water being able to sink down because the density barrier that normally makes it hard for surface and deep water to mix is much less pronounced in Antarctica. It's also fascinating because the pressure winds contribute. The pressure winds actually push the sea ice away from the coast, making the gaps, the polynyas. That leads to more sea ice formation. That leads to water getting salty and Antarctic bottom water sinking. I talked about how Antarctica's ice sheets give it high albedo. And then lastly, another one that kind of gets jammed in there because there's not another easy place to put it. I talked about the Southern Lights a little bit and how So above the stratosphere in the atmosphere, you get to the mesosphere where meteors burn up, and then the thermosphere, which is kind of where you're starting to get gas escaping into space. And that's where the southern lights occur. The magnetic field is a bit weaker above the pole, actually, and there end up being more flare-ups between charged particles entering Earth's atmosphere and gases in the thermosphere. So I have a short list of key terms here, and I do have this posted on Gaucho Space also. I will post this video also for whatever use that might be. But you'll notice there's more, if you came to the previous review session, you'll notice there's more terms here. That's just because it's two lectures instead of one. Remember, the first week I didn't test you on the first lecture because I don't need to test you on how long I was at McMurdo or anything like that. But the terms all relate to either atmospheric circulation, surface ocean circulation, or deep water circulation. And those are kind of the main three topics I ended up covering last week. Those are all with the lab that you are doing this week. There are three parts to that lab, kind of broken up in the same way. You do a couple exercises with atmospheric circulation cells, then you look at surface ocean currents, and then you answer a couple questions about deep water currents, but mostly really just about Antarctic bottom water. These terms are all in last week's slides. They're mostly the underlined and bolded key terms. And when I say not exhaustive, I simply mean that, like I said before, if you know what all these terms mean, you'll probably do well, but you might lack some context. So you want to make sure that before you take the quiz, ideally you've seen all the lectures, and if not seen all the lectures, I do put pretty extensive notes in the in the PowerPoint versions of the lecture slides. If you've been going off the PDFs, those don't show up in there, but my PowerPoint slides have pretty extensive notes, which are mostly what I lecture off of. So if you only have time to ever look at the PowerPoint slides and you don't have time to look at a lecture, make sure you take a look at those notes on the slides, just because that actually is pretty close to a script of what I say during the lecture. I try not to go too off script when I'm reading that. I do a little bit, but most of the important stuff is in those notes. If you absolutely have to use those for a broader explanation of these terms rather than any of these videos. I do specifically want to do a brief Coriolis effect review because I don't think that can be emphasized enough times. The Coriolis effect is weird because it produces what seem like two dramatically different results. Stuff gets deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. But the thing is, it's being caused by the same process. It's being caused by the fact that whether you're not in the northern or southern hemisphere, Earth is rotating the same way. Earth is going to be rotating from the west to the east. Now, what happens then is that Earth is not rotating at the same speed at every latitude. And as you go either north from the equator or south from the equator, you're going to be standing on a part of the Earth that is rotating more slowly. So the Coriolis effect doesn't really have any effect on simply like people walking at the surface. When we're walking at the surface, we are just rotating at the speed of whatever latitude we're standing at. It affects projectiles, so that's why airplanes or cannonballs are often used as examples. And it affects wind currents especially. That's where it usually first comes up in discussion, because we learn about how you would expect masses of air to just flow in a straight line from one latitude to the next, but because you're moving from one latitude to the other, that mass of air moving in the upper atmosphere is not, it's going to and again, some people don't like anthropomorphizing this, but however you want to put it, it's going to think it's still rotating with the ground where it started. It gets up in the air and it acts as if it's still on the ground, rotating at the same speed as the ground at the latitude where it started. And that's fundamentally what happens to an airplane also. The reason it gets deflected is because it is essentially, if it's trying to move in a straight line from the equator to one of the poles, it's going to be going too fast. it's going to be, its rotation is going to be too fast compared to the ground underneath it. And so instead of going straight from the equator to the pole, it's going to get curved with the direction of Earth's rotation. It's going to look like it's being pulled along by the Earth, and kind of it is, because it's overcompensating. It's acting like it's still at the equator, but it's not. And the reason this happens too, and when I say right and left, you have to remember that it is relative to the direction it would have had with no Coriolis effect. If Earth were not rotating, there would be no Coriolis effect. If Earth were not rotating at all, an airplane could fly a straight line from the equator to the North Pole with no correction needed. But what happens is it gets deflected, and it gets deflected in a direction that, if you are facing in the same direction as the intended direction, it's going to appear to be deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere, because that's the direction that Earth's rotation takes it in. And it's kind of the same way that you have to be careful about, like, why people say, oh, my right, and it's like, no, I don't mean your right, I mean my right. Like, you have to specify that when you're trying to explain something to other people. When dealing with the Coriolis effect, you have to try to put yourself from the point of view as the projectile or the mass of air as much as possible. You have to put yourself in the viewpoint of, okay, the mass of air was supposed to go this way, so the way it's actually going is that to the left or to the right of the direction I thought it was going to go. And that is because you get the different directions because Earth doesn't rotate different directions in different hemispheres. Like, you don't have the northern hemisphere rotating west to east and the southern hemisphere rotating east to west. That would be a really weird, messed up mechanical planet, probably. That sounds like a weird Death Star type of situation. Earth is rotating the same way no matter what hemisphere you're in, but another way to put it is, whether you're going, let's see, whether you're going, so if you're going, say, south to north, whether you're going to come across slower latitudes or faster latitudes depends on what hemisphere you're in. Because if you go from the equator north, you're going to start hitting slower latitudes and you're going to get deflected to the right of just the north path. Now, if you are in the southern hemisphere and you start heading north, that actually means you're going to start hitting faster latitudes, essentially, because you're going to be getting closer to the equator. Now, you're still actually going to get deflected to the left of your original direction, because you're kind of going to get pulled in the direction away from Earth's rotation. You're kind of undercompensating in a sense. You're acting like, I need to act like I haven't rotated this much, because as you go from south to north, because you're going from the South Pole to the equator, you think you're going at a slow latitude, but you're actually going to faster and faster latitudes. So you're kind of undercompensating. Anyway, I apologize for the background noise. It's apparently garbage collection day at my apartment complex. Anyway, does anyone want to ask anything specific about the Coriolis effect, or has a particular bit I want to go over? Because I have a good feeling that if you have questions, other people do too, and there's a good chance it'll be helpful.
I have a question for the blue globe kind of on the right, that one. Will the arrows always be that direction?
When you say that direction, what do you mean?
For the arrows that are pointing like in the northern hemisphere, how one of them's pointing north and one of them's pointing south. Like if it change, like if the globe's spinning in a different direction, like should we just memorize those or will they just be changing?
Those are actually, so that's basically what happens. So just going with the northern hemisphere, the one on the right is an air current going from the equator to the pole, being deflected to the east a bit and to the right of the original direction. And the other arrow, the one on the left, is a hypothetical current of air moving from the pole to the equator and being deflected to the west, and yes, to the right of the original direction. But you kind of see what I mean by they get deflected in different compass directions depending on what compass direction they're flowing. But regardless of the compass direction involved, it's going to be to the right of the original path. I don't know if, can you see the white arrow now?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, great. So the white arrow now is tracing, so this is what the air current would do if there were no rotation. Since there's rotation, it goes over here. And if you were trying to put yourself in the viewpoint of the air current itself, this is to the right of that. Now it's to the left. From our viewpoint, it's to the left because it's on the screen. But if you had like the first person viewpoint of, say, somebody riding that current of air, you were being deflected to the right. Like if you're trying to go from the pole to the equator, you get dragged over here. That's to the right from the viewpoint of, say, the pilot trying to fly from the North Pole to the equator. It looks like it's being deflected to our left, but it's to the pilot or the air current's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and same thing in the southern hemisphere with the left, because you see this is the example. The arrow is still visible, I think. This is the example where you have air currents going from Antarctica to the equator, and the reason you're ending up over here, see, Earth rotation is going the other way from west to east. So as you go from Antarctica to the equator, the ground underneath you is going faster and faster and faster. You still think you're moving really slowly. Like you still think you're in Antarctica, basically. So you end up going over here, which is to the left of this original deflection, of this original direction. And likewise, this arrow over here to the lower right is what you get if you are going from the equator to the South Pole, because going from the equator to the South Pole, you're going due south. And if you're facing due south, this is to the left. So you have to be careful just with not mixing up compass directions and the terms left and right. Left and right refer to the viewpoint of whatever projectile, or the pilot in the airplane that's being affected by the Coriolis effect, if you do want to anthropomorphize it. That's an excellent, yes.
So if I say I was hunting on Antarctica, if I shoot a bullet, how is the Coriolis effect going to affect that?
If that bullet was actually going to cross multiple latitudes, if you shot it towards the equator, that would be like if you were standing at the South Pole, you shot that towards the equator, it would kind of go west. Like you'd be thinking, it would go west of what you were intending, which is to the left of where you're standing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep, precisely. And bullets don't really usually get affected by it because they don't travel long enough for the latitude difference to be noticeable. But hypothetically, yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
In the lecture, you were describing like the Coriolis effect and then Coriolis force.
You don't need to worry too much about that. The force is just the name for the force that causes the effect. Like it's yeah, they're linked, and you don't need to fret about the distinction.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other quick Coriolis effect questions before I move on? There's not a lot left in the presentation. I just wanted to linger on that. And those were excellent questions. Thank you. And I think that will also be, and I'm very happy, I think this will also be very helpful to have some student thoughts on that, because me going blah, blah, blah about it only does so much, I think. So one thing I want to say is that with ocean circulation, when you first start out learning circulation, you have to remind yourself, am I dealing with what's going on at the surface, or do I care about ocean water sinking or rising at all? At the surface, pretty much all that's relevant to driving ocean water is winds and the Coriolis effect. And winds and the Coriolis effect together make Ekman transport, Ekman transport drives me crazy in that there's a very strong urge to see something that says, oh, this is the wind direction, and be like, oh, I have to put the Coriolis effect in. And no, the Coriolis effect is getting brought up because the wind has presumably been deflected by the Coriolis effect already, and this arrow showing wind direction here is the actual direction of wind, and we are presuming that we have already dealt with the Coriolis effect on the wind. However, the Coriolis effect causes the water that's being moved by the wind to get deflected a second time, essentially. And what you need to know basically is that is that this second deflection is also either going to be to the right in the northern hemisphere or the left in the southern hemisphere of the wind direction. Whichever wind direction is given, the ocean water is either overall going to move in a direction that's 90 degrees to the right of that original wind direction in the northern hemisphere, or if you're in the southern hemisphere, it'll be 90 degrees to the left. And the reason it happens that way is because mathematically, if you combine the different directions that all the layers of water are moving in and kind of take into account how strong the force is at each layer of water, the overall movement of water ends up being 90 degrees to the right or left, even though the surface current, if you're just looking at the surface water, like on here, the surface current gets only deflected 45 degrees or so. Because normally, if you look at like the wind, if you look at the Coriolis effect on wind, you don't get usually that strong a deflection. The reason we depict it as the strong a deflection is because that's overall the direction the water moves in. If you're trying to make a general statement about, okay, the water from the surface to 100 meters down is moving in what direction, overall, that's what direction it's moving in. And that's important in terms of like where the nutrients overall are ending up and where heat is overall ending up, because surface currents bring heat or take away heat. And one reason Antarctica is so cold is because a big cold surface current around Antarctica does a good job of keeping warm surface waters from getting anywhere near it. Thermohaline circulation is driven more heavily by temperature and salinity differences, which overall lead to density differences. And we care about that in Antarctica because in Antarctica, the density differences that normally make it hard for surface and deep water to mix are not as pronounced because there is less evaporation and more freshwater runoff from melting glaciers. This is also true in the Arctic. And sea ice formation actually causes Antarctic bottom water to form. And Antarctic bottom water formation drives a big portion of thermohaline circulation. You don't need to memorize this diagram, by the way. I stick that in there because it kind of gives you a big picture of how water overall moves throughout the world. It's kind of like thermohaline circulation ends up being much more of kind of a big picture situation than surface circulation. For one thing, because it occurs on such a long time scale. Once Antarctic bottom water ends up at the bottom of the ocean, it's going to be down there for hundreds of years, possibly even thousands of years, because it takes a very long time for it to reach another point where it can so easily circulate between the surface and lower waters again. So regarding the lab this week, again, if you haven't done the lab already, the first thing you should do is check the TA presentation. They did a really nice job they put a Coriolis effect review in there and tried to link how it relates to the specific lab questions you have. They did a nice job of including some key terms like upwelling and downwelling and an overview of what terms like westerly wind mean, because some of these terms are things that I've briefly mentioned in lecture, but they did a nice job of emphasizing what you need to know for the lab. And don't get the three parts mixed up. Like if you need to kind of compartmentalize it, you can, like if you find yourself struggling, you can think, okay, there's the atmosphere, there's the surface ocean, and there's deep ocean. Like which of these questions can I deal with now? Which do I need to go back to lecture questions to? Which of these do I need to ask the TA about or review my lecture material on? So it's not a big lab, but it's kind of like it's kind of like three small labs in one. Like it's three sets of it's a couple questions about these three different topics, and if you need to review the lecture material, you know where to look for these. Does anybody else have questions that they're comfortable with having recorded or anything in particular that I've gone over in this review session? Okay, so I'm listening, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Go on.
I just have a technical question about the quiz.
Yes.
For the written response, like how detailed are we supposed to
like I said, 2 sentences at most, or two to three sentences. So it's not an essay question.
Yeah.
I think Gaucho Space lists it as an essay because that's the option I had to pick to have a manually graded what was I saying? To have like a manually graded response, but I'm not looking for an essay. I'm looking for, I mean, if you want to write more, you can. It's just like, yeah. Honestly, yeah, honestly, the TAs are going to kind of be looking for like, okay, mostly did this person answer the question? So don't make it hard for the TA to figure out if you answered the question or not.
Gotcha.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the content of the quiz would be like similar question style to like lab questions.
That's an excellent point. And the answer is not really, because the labs are not meant to be timed. The labs, you have a while to sit and look at figures and interpret them. The quizzes in the exam are ideally there to make sure that you've studied and that you can reasonably recall the material you've studied with some context. So the quiz, like the quizzes and tests, like there will be sometimes questions based on pictures, but they'll be much shorter and they won't expect you to, they'll be a little more like,
why do you have so much trouble sleeping these days?
Oh, that's someone talking to a pet. I was confused. Sorry, it took me a minute. What was I saying? The labs tend to be a little more, I wouldn't say open-ended, because I do realize the labs are all now automatically graded, but when I wrote this quiz, I like had a key term that I'd put either in this review session or in the review session for last week, but it's labeled in the lecture slides as a key term somewhere also. Like I had a key term in mind when I wrote all the questions. So it's much more based, so the quiz is much more based on like key terms from lecture and important facts from lecture that we lingered on more than say interpreting a diagram. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. As for the short answer questions, the short answer questions are, I'll say one of them is kind of based on media, like articles and stuff, and the other one is kind of based. The other one is just a response about one of the broader topics from the lectures. So the short answer questions are a bit more broad. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and shut the recording off, and people are welcome to stick around and continue to ask me questions. I'm happy to go over other specific things individually if people want, but